Morning, everyone, and welcome to the introduction to the FileMaker Data API. Thank you for getting in here so promptly, and I'm amazed at the number of you who have come along, so thank you for that. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Steve Winter. I've been a FileMaker developer since before I had gray hair, and you can tell by how much of it I've got, that's quite a while. I'm not saying FileMaker gave me the gray hair, but maybe. I put up there that I'm one of those people that the local immigration officials in the US don't particularly like. I've lived in 4 countries in the last 10 years. Visited a number of others that make people a little nervous if you're in the current administration. I've been to most DevCons over recent years, except I missed one in 2016 because I went off on a little road trip, which took me from Beijing to Istanbul. A bit over 8,500 miles, and just for added fun, I did it on my bicycle. And to prove that I am completely mad, I'm doing it again in October this year. Not quite so far, only about 4,500 miles from Casablanca in Morocco down to Cape Coast in Ghana. So if you're interested, I keep a blog that helps keep me sane while I'm on the road. So yeah, the URL's in the slides. So check that out and follow along on my next mad adventure. So today's session, a little bit of expectation management. This is a beginner session, so I'm assuming nothing. I'm going to go through all of the very, very basic steps that are needed to get your data out with a FileMaker Data API. Having said that, we're going to move reasonably quickly through that, and then I've got some examples at the end that I want to show you different use cases and different things you can do with that Data API. And some of that is a little bit more complex. All of the sessions this year are being recorded, so there are recordings that you can come back to. All of the demonstration materials are in the FileMaker community, and they're available there for you to download. And that includes the source code for JavaScript stuff and the app I'll show you at the end and so on. So all of those things are there for you to recap on if you choose to. What are we going to look at? We'll start off with an introduction to what REST is. That's the underlying technology or the protocol that's used by the Data API. We'll have a look at this concept of where REST and CRUD kind of meet together. We'll meet our friendly postman, who is a very good friend when we're dealing with APIs of any sort. We'll look at the authentication and the tokens that are used for the API, configuring FileMaker Server and a custom app, and then interacting with other systems. So those are the things that we're going to cover off. I'm planning that there's about 45 minutes worth of content, so there should be plenty of time for questions at the end. If you've got anything that's burning throughout the session, then I will take short questions. I thought I'd start with the end at the beginning and just very quickly show you one of the things that the Data API lets us do in a way that is really, really simple. So on the right-hand side, you'll see my website. I have an inventory system in FileMaker on the left-hand side, and I sell electric drills. You can see in my product list on the right-hand side that the second electric drill down there doesn't seem to have a price, and it's currently showing as being out of stock. If I drill down into that, then we can see that there's no price, there's no image, and there's none available. So I'm going to fix that on the left-hand side in FileMaker. You can see up here on my desktop, I've got a picture of a drill. I'll just drag and drop that down into my FileMaker container. And I buy these things for £100. I live in England, excuse me. I buy these things for £100. I reckon I'm going to sell them for $149.95. And the good thing is that they were out of stock, but I received a delivery of 120 of them today. Which, if I commit that record, brings it back into stock. If I reload my web page over here on the right-hand side, we find that all of that data that I've just put into FileMaker is refreshing in my website. It's happening not quite like WebDirect does in real time, but it certainly happens as soon as any of the changes are made in FileMaker. And so that's the sort of thing that the Data API allows us to do. It allows us, at its simplest level, to pull data out of FileMaker. As we go along, we'll start to see that not only can we get data out, we can push it back in again as well. an introduction to REST. What is REST? Well, we start, as always, with our quotes from Wikipedia because, Wikipedia is the source of all knowledge. Wikipedia says that REST, or representational state transfer, is a style that defines constraints and properties based on HTTP. HTTP is the protocol that's used for pretty much all communication that's web-based. Web services that conform to the REST style, or RESTful web services, provide interoperability between computer systems on the internet. And that's really what we're aiming for with the Data API. There's a few bits that are a little bit more important as well. REST-compliant web services allow the requesting systems to access and manipulate textual representations. And that's important, textual representations of web resources by using a uniform and predefined set of stateless operations. Now, some of those things are really quite important. The uniform and the predefined one particularly, because we have to know how we're going to access these resources that we want to get access to. And stateless is very important as well. Basically, it means that the communication is transient. You saw that in the demonstration I did. I was updating FileMaker, and when I reloaded the page, the data appeared. And that's because there is no state. There's no storing of state between FileMaker and my website. Now, you can store state on the receiving end, but there are some things you have to be conscious of when you're doing that, and we'll get to them shortly. I said that REST was used the HTTP protocol, and the HTTP protocol has a number of methods or verbs. These are actions that you can perform. What I'm going to do is look at how we map those actions to the actions that we think of when we're talking about a database. So that concept of CRUD, create, read, update, delete. The first HTTP method that's important is GET. Now, GET is one that's familiar to everybody because that's basically what you use when you type the address into a browser bar and you hit enter. That's using the GET method. It's used to transfer information across. And that last sentence there is really important. Requests using GET should only retrieve data and should have no other effect. You need to be careful about how you use GET. And one of the things that you can do with the Data API is that you can run scripts, but you need to maintain that concept that a GET request should only be pulling the data and not having any side effects. Post is what happens when you go to a website, you fill in a form, you hit the submit button. You're using the post request. And the idea behind a post is that you are sending the data and a new entity is being created. So GET is pulling stuff out, post is putting stuff in when you're creating. Patch is used for updating. So it works in a similar way to post in that you build up a set of data and you send it to the server using the patch request. But rather than post, which creates, patch is intended to update. The last one is the simplest of them all, and that's delete. And it does exactly what it says on the tin. It takes away the thing that you are identifying. All of the URIs that are used with the Data API begin the same. HTTPS, and the S is important. You do need to be using SSL when you're using the RESTful API, and so basically you need the HTTPS. You put on your server, and then you add in parameters. You can see here that the create of CRUD uses the post method. You post your data to FMI, Data V1 databases, the name of the database that you want to create the record in, a layout, the name of the layout, and then records. Like other FileMaker integration methods like the custom web publishing, the XML interface, the Data API is also layout-based. So all of your communication that happens is happening using those two parameters, the database itself and the layout that you're interacting through. And that's important. You do need to have a layout in there that has the fields that you want to interact with on it. So to get records, you can offer at the end there, optionally, you can put a record ID on there. If you use a GET request and you place a record ID on there, you will get just the one record. If you add a query string to the end of it or in the body of the message you send, you can get perform a find, a search. Patch to update, you have to provide the record ID. Fairly obviously, you need to tell the system which record that you're updating. The record ID that you're using here is the FileMaker internal record ID. And delete, the same thing. Same URL concept with the database, the layout, and then the record ID at the end. On the left-hand side, my FileMaker database. On the right-hand side is a tool called Postman. I said we were going to meet the Postman. Postman is a really useful tool for working with APIs. It allows us to use all of the different protocols that we might need, the get, post, patch, delete. It also allows us to create a body and to see the responses that come and go. So I use Postman for pretty much anything. When I start working with a new API, I use that because it's very flexible and it allows me to see what's going on fairly transparently. So you can see here that the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to perform post. I want to create a new record. So here I've got my data that I'm about to submit. I post that in, and we see up here in FileMaker that we've got a new record has been created that's got that data that I was posting in, so for Fred's spoon. The response that I've got back includes the record ID of the record that was just created. If I want to get that data back, I add that record ID onto the end of my URL, and I send off that request. And you can see that FileMaker has returned all of the data that's in there to me. If I make a change in FileMaker over this side, and then update the name of the person, and come back here and perform my request again, you can see that that new data is being sent over to FileMaker. That's using a GET request. If I wanted to do things the other way around, I need to use a patch. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an email address into my user. Here's the email address in my payload. We can see the email address in FileMaker is empty. I perform the request, and I get that updated field in FileMaker, and I get a new modification ID come back to say that that record has been updated. Now, I said that if we want to do a find, then we are going to specify our find criteria and then send the data. And that will return to us a list of all of the records which match that find. Now, one of the things that we can do in the find request is much as we can do in FileMaker, we can add specific queries to it. So you can see that I was looking for Fred. If I add an equals to Fred, then that's like doing an equals equals, an exact match. So that will only find Fred rather than finding Frederick or other people as well. The last thing that we can do with this is that we can perform that delete request. And so we have the record ID at the top, we send the request, and FileMaker comes back to us and says that the code is 0, message OK, and there's no response because that record has now been deleted. A word of caution. I said that the record IDs that I used are the internal record IDs that are in FileMaker. Now, as many of you probably know, those record IDs are automatically created when a record is created in FileMaker. Unfortunately, they aren't permanent, and they aren't always guaranteed to be the same. Basically, that makes the stateless part of REST really important. What it means is that you want to make sure that the other side that's pulling data from FileMaker isn't storing those record IDs. Because for argument's sake, if you are updating your system by importing data, then those record IDs can change. And so you just want to be very careful that if you have your remote system pull data and it stores record IDs, you can't be 100% sure that you're going to be changing the same record in the future. So you need to make sure if you are trying to store state that you're using some kind of a UUID that you generate in your table as well. But it does mean that you do have to do 2 queries in order to update a record. You need to use your UUID to find the record to get its FileMaker record ID, and then use that to do your update or your delete. So it is something you do just need to be a little bit cautious of. But what about security, I hear you say? Did I hear you say that? I hoped I heard you say that, because basically at that point it looked like I was just sending and receiving data and nothing much was happening. Do not panic. FileMaker's got your back, as you would expect. Basically, there are two things that you have to do in order to make all of this work. One, you have to enable the FileMaker Data API on your FileMaker server. And two, you have to enable the fmrest extended privilege for at least one user. Okay? So two steps that you have to take. And the third thing is the user has to authenticate before they can use the API. So you actually have to log in. In my little demo there, I skipped the logging in step. We'll look at that more. So let's look at enabling the FileMaker Data API. Here's my FileMaker server admin console. I'm going to log in there with my super secure password. And here's my console. You can see that right now I've just got my demo file on my server. If I come across to the connectors, choose the FileMaker the Data API, you can see right now it's disabled. I toggle that switch. That's it. Done. That's all you need to do to enable the Data API. Once you've done that, FileMaker Server is ready to go. The Data API is on, and it's there waiting for requests to come in. While we're talking about FileMaker Server, the Data API has usage limits associated with it. It's included in your license, and the amount of data you get is the number of users times 2 gigabytes per month times 12 months equals your annual allowance. You've got 3 users by 2 gig by 12 months means you've got 72 gigabytes of data. Someone I was talking to at the beginning referred to it as a family plan because basically it's measuring outbound traffic, but it's aggregated across all users. So it's not just the users who are using the Data API who get that quota, but every user you have a license for gets the quota. If you run out of data, then the API will return a 953 error code. And we'll have a look at what you need to do about that. I would suggest if you've got a business-critical app that's using the Data API, you need to be checking every request that gets made to see if that 953 error comes back, and it needs to be zipping you some kind of an alert to let you know. You can purchase additional data if you exceed that. The bit about the family plan is kind of important because that 72 gigabytes, I could use that in the first week. And I can use the whole lot over any amount of time. So whilst it's an amount per user per month, actually it's just a whole blob of data that you can use at any point. In the FileMaker admin console, it shows you how much of the data you have used, and it gives you a count of the level there in the console so that you can use that to keep track of how much data has been used. As I said, it's only the outbound traffic that's being recorded. So basically, as you're pushing stuff in to FileMaker, there's no cost associated with that. That traffic isn't monitored. It's just the content coming out that is. So step 1 was enable the server. Step 2 is about enabling your app. So basically, we switch over to FileMaker, and I'm going to open that ITG01 demo file that's on my server. And I want to set up some users in here. Go into Manage Security, pop in my super secure password, admin. That's what we all use, right? I'm going to start by creating 2 privilege sets. Basically, I'm going to create one which is a full access privilege set. So I'm going to allow this to have access to all records, to create, update, and delete across all records. I'm going to allow it to access all layouts and to run all scripts that I want it to. The very bottom there, I enable the REST extended privilege. I'm going to go through that again and create a second read-only account. Because sometimes you may want data just to be pulled out by the Data API and not for that user to be able to update. View only, scroll down to the bottom, tick the fmrest extended permission, OK, and we're done. So now I've got 2 privilege sets. What I want to do is create 2 users, one which matches each of those. At this point, I'm just building users that are going to act as API users. So these aren't individual users that may also be able to access the REST API. I'm just adding in users that can be used by APIs. Give them their username, their password, and then associate them with the appropriate privilege set. So that's my full access user, and rinse and repeat, create a read-only account. Set super secure password QWERTY1 ! Because that's what we use, isn't it? Yeah. And make that my read-only user. And then we OK that, and super secure password. I'm so looking forward to that dialog not coming up. That's going to be cool. And that's it. We're done. OK? 2 pretty easy, pretty straightforward steps. One on the server, one in the app. The first change we made on the server is global. You only have to do that once, and it's across all apps that are running on your server. The second change, where we create privilege sets and then we create users, you have to do that for every app that you want someone to be able to access. The user has to authenticate. So basically, we have to log in and we have to get that token. We're going to pop back over to Postman again here, and we're going to do that authentication piece. You can see here that I'm going to do a post request. I'm going to post it to my server, and I'm going to post to a special endpoint that I didn't mention, which is the sessions endpoint. You can see I have the database name, ITG01 demo, and then a special endpoint called sessions. And that's where FileMaker is managing the users who are currently logged in to the Data API. In order to log in, I have to send 2 pieces of information. I have to send a username and a password. So I'm using the Data API full access account, and I'm using the super secure QWERTY1 ! I'm showing the password to you. Please, don't hack my system. And basically, we are making a post request. And so we have to send a body into our request as well, but at this point, we just send an empty body. So you can see here, we also have to set a header to say we're going to send and receive JSON. What comes back is a token. We get a response body, which has a token in it. It's this great big long blah, 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 blah thing here. When we want to make requests in the future, we have to send that token in again as well. So you can see here that I'm setting an authorization to have a bearer, and I'm passing that token that I've got. So basically what we do is we log in with our username and our password first of all. FileMaker checks our credentials and gives us back a token. It's always a great big long alphanumeric hash that comes back. Every subsequent request we make, we have to send that token in. And so at that point, the Data API says, hey, you're asking for this thing. Based on that token you've got, I'm going to work out whether or not you're allowed access. And so it saves having to send credentials every time you want to make a request. The tokens are valid for 15 minutes after they were last used. So you can continue to make requests with the same token in perpetuity, as long as they don't expire. If you're ever building any integration with a Data API, you do have to trap for the possibility that your token has expired. It might have expired because the session timed out after 15 minutes and FileMaker Server disconnected you. It might have expired because FileMaker Server was restarted in between getting it and using it again. So at any time when you're making requests and you're passing in that token, you have to expect that that token may fail because it's expired. And so you have to be prepared to re-authenticate to get a new token and to carry on. That's pretty much how it works. Set up the server, set up the user accounts, log in, get your token, make your requests. So we know what REST is, our server's ready, our app's ready, we've got all the right credentials. Let's go forth and connect to the world. One of the things that I'm often asked to do in the work that I do is people want to get their FileMaker data into their website. Because in the demo I showed you at the beginning, they want to be able to update their inventory and have their website update for them. One of the more common website building tools is WordPress, and so what we've been able to do is use that data API to access the data and pull it into our WordPress site. So what I showed you before was that I was making changes to FileMaker on the left and my website on the right was updating. If I take a look at editing this page, you can see here that I'm using a special WordPress construct, which is called a short tag. And I've written a WordPress plugin which lets me use this thing called FM data and then add FM data field. And so you can see here that my table on my web page of all of the information is made up of a series of requests for an FM data field. So what's happening here is that we're saying to FileMaker, hey, I want you to look on the product layout, and I want you to use the ID field part number, and I want to get the URL ID, and I want to get the field called name. And so basically all we're doing here is we are making an on-the-fly request to FileMaker. And it's going, the data API is compiling that query that it needs, it's sending it off to FileMaker, getting it back, and pushing it into our web page for us. Because I'd like to show you a demonstration and some examples in a language that is familiar to all of us, I've built a very simple FileMaker Go-based app which allows me to manage contacts in my Go app. The assumption here is, as the chaps with the electricity problem that we were hearing about in the previous session, they're often disconnected. This is them here. I've only got my phone plugged in so that you can see it on the screen, I promise. Okay? On the left-hand side is my FileMaker database. So I'm looking at my phone, and I can see right now that there are 0 records in here. Okay, here we go. Let's try something different. Let's add a new contact. Let's say that this is Mr. Fred. Spoon. Done. And let's, wow. I tested this like 50 times in the hour before this session started. Let's have a look at what should be happening, shall we? Over here in FileMaker, we'll take a look at the scripts that are being used behind the scenes. I said that the first thing that we need to do is that we need to log in. And so in order to log in, we need to go through that process that I was showing you in Postman. You can see here that for clarity, I'm using some global variables. I'm setting the server into a global variable, the name of the database, the layout, and all of the permissions that are used. You can see here that what I'm doing is I'm creating a variable here called credentials. When you need to log in, you need to pass in the username, a colon, the password, and you need to base 64 encode them. Thank you, FileMaker, for giving us a native function to do that. So basically, we encode the username and the password together, and then we use our URL to create endpoint that we need to call. You'll see here that I'm setting a variable called data, and I'm setting that to an empty set of curly braces. I'm basically creating an empty JSON object. Now, the reason that we have to do that is that the authentication endpoint is a post method. Now, if you try and post with nothing, it gets horribly confused at the far end, because post is supposed to create. And so if you post and you're creating, you must be needing to send some data. If you're trying to integrate the FileMaker Data API from FileMaker scripts, this one will catch you out if you are not careful. because without that you will get a really weird error about content length invalid. And that's because you didn't send an empty nothing along the way. We're setting up some options here for our curl request. A couple of lines at the top just so that we can do some debugging. We're doing a post because that's how we create our authentication. We have to send in that data, which is the data ASCII. The ampersand before the variable says, hey, FileMaker, don't send the string $DATA. Go out and find what's in the variable and stick that in instead. We have to tell it that we're sending JSON, and we have to send that authorization header. So you can see here that I'm saying authorization, basic, and then I'm getting that credentials that I created. So I compile all of those things together into my options variable, and then basically I do insert from URL. I put the contents into a variable. I call the URL with the options that we've compiled. I'm then doing some checking in here to make sure that we have got we've got a valid response back. And you can see here that it's up to you, but you need to do something, and what I'm doing is showing a custom dialog, which unfortunately we've just seen twice. So this is also the place where you'd want to check for that 953, no data allowance left, because that's the error that you'd get back if you were trying to use the API and you'd run out of data. The very last thing that I'm doing here in the script is just setting that token into a global variable. I'm putting it there in a global variable so that it's accessible to me for all of my subsequent requests. When I was trying to get records, I was doing much of the same thing. At the top here, you can see that I'm checking to make sure I've got a token. I create my URL. I create my options. In this case, I need to send a different authorization header. In the first example, I sent an authorization type basic. And basically, that was basic authorization. Now, because I have my token, I send authorization of type bearer. And in that case, I send that API token that I've got stored there. And again, I tell it that I'm using JSON that I'm sending along. When we go off and perform our insert from URL, we come down here and we check the response code. So I'm looking to see if it was not 0 and it was a question mark. And I'm looking here to see if I got error 1631. Error 1631 is an authentication error. So basically what I do at that point is I try to log back in again, and I try to perform the request again. So this is my way of checking to see, of dealing with my token having expired. Because I make my request, FileMaker says, error 1631, authentication failed. I go, okay, I'll log back in, and then I'll just run my request again. Hopefully this time I'll get something back. If not, well, we get that custom dialog again. From there on, basically, I'm taking the response body, I'm looping through the data, I'm setting fields, and I'm exiting at the end once I've got all of my data that I've just pulled in and updated. What else can we do? We can call scripts. We can upload container content. And one important thing that we can also do is that we can log out. So let's have a look at connecting from JavaScript. And we can see here that on the left-hand side, I've got a contacts database. It has 5,000 records in it. And each of the records has people in a state. On the right-hand side, I've got a chart that shows the number of people by state in my data set. Now, what this is doing is that chart is calling the Data API, and it's calling a script. And that script is populating a virtual list table and then sending the data back. And so what that allows me to do is then to chart that data. In the spirit of it's all gone horribly wrong, let's find all the people that live in San Diego, which, as many of you know, is in California. Not anymore. San Diego is on the move. The residents of San Diego no longer live in California. They are going to live in, I think, North Dakota, because not enough people live in North Dakota. Let's move some folk about. Let's say people who are in San Diego need to move to North Dakota. Okay, now my chart refreshes every couple of minutes, and it works. Did you notice? The number of people in North Dakota went up, the number of people in California went down. Let's have a few more people suffer that fate. Everyone from Dallas is also, sorry, I hope no one here is from North Dakota. I know nothing about North Dakota. I only picked it because it had 0, sorry. I hope you're not from North Dakota. Okay, let's move everyone that lives in Dallas to North Dakota as well, and we should see the Texas peak go down, and we should see the North Dakota peak go up. And then, what the heck, let's just move a whole bunch of people around randomly. So basically, there's a script that's perform script on server that's slowly shifting people from San Francisco to North Carolina, from New York to New Jersey. And so basically, you can see that my chart is updating in real time to reflect the changes that are happening in FileMaker. Now, this is why I created that read-only account, because this is a JavaScript application. And I'm sure, as many of you know, if you right-click in a website and you go view page source, you can see all of the content, and you can see there's a JavaScript file, and you can click in there, and if we search for fmrest.msdev, you can see right down here that it's saying, here's my server name, here's my username, and right next to it's my password. So if you're considering using the Data API in a very, very public-facing way, like on a website, you need to make sure that the credentials that you use for that access are extremely restricted. Because as you can see, I can very, very quickly find those credentials here. Now, they have to be there because the only way to access the FileMaker data is to log in and get a token and use that token. Those tokens are short-lived, which means you can't permanently embed a token there. So you have to have those credentials there. Obviously, you could use something to encrypt that and then decrypt that. But again, it's ultimately that username and password are still going to be there. So you do need to be very, very conscious of the account that's used and the permissions that it has. This is my JavaScript that's generating that chart. You can see here that there are two methods called refresh data and fetch data. The refresh data is called by a timeout, and basically it's doing two things. It's doing a query, which says, give me all of the records in the table where column 1 is greater than 0. And it's also saying, before you do that request, run a script. So you can see here, this is how we go about passing in other parameters to the Data API. You can see here where I'm saying perform request. I'm saying I want to do a post to the layout. I'm calling this special endpoint called find, and I'm passing in that data as part of that post request. So I'm saying perform a query, and before you do that, run the script set states. And that's populating my virtual list table. On my phone, I've built a native iOS app. It happens to be a native iOS app because I'm at an Apple subsidiary conference. But it could be a native app for another platform if one happened to exist where you wanted to be able to get your data from that device onto FileMaker. So I've made the magic FileMaker image uploader. Native iOS app, native, here, take photo, point camera at audience, tap photo button, tap use photo. Notice that photo appears. Notice that the take photo button stays gray. Hey, notice that a record turned up in FileMaker. Hey, notice there's a map with a pen on. Hey, notice it works. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm using the Data API to do a bunch of things. Basically, my app is using all of the capabilities of the device. It gets the location, the lat and long, it uses the camera, it uploads it. It calls the FileMaker Data API. It says, hey, FileMaker, make me a new record. Here's the lat and long. And it puts in the lat and long into a couple of fields. FileMaker goes, I know what to do with them, asks Google for a map, puts a little pen on there. That's really cool. The next thing that happens is that image file gets uploaded. And that's one of the really cool new bits of functionality in the FileMaker 17 Data API that wasn't there in 16, is the ability to upload stuff to containers. So that's really, really handy because as you can see, I don't have to do anything at all. I just say, FileMaker, upload this into this container. And there it is. You're probably wondering, where do I find all this information? If you go to https:/fmi/data/API-doc, all of the API documentation is there. And it tells you how to go about putting together the query strings that you need. It tells you how to go about making the requests in the correct way. That's available on any FileMaker server that you have access to. There are also loads of resources available to help you with this. Lots of packages to help bring all of these things together. There is a great community page, which Rosemary showed an extract of at the keynote last night, Doc 9197, which Mark, who's somewhere in the audience, has been putting together, that shows all of the different ways to make integrating the Data API with your solution easier. There's also a bunch of resources for this session that are on the community page about that, which will help you to get started with that. Questions? Okay, the question is the custom web publishing API restricted by the same limits? No, it's not. The custom web publishing, PHP API, and the XML interface remain unaffected by the limits of the Data API. So this is only the Data API which is restricted by the limits. Can you just re-authenticate with user password instead of dealing with the token? No. The only way that you can access data is to use the authorization bearer and pass in the token. So you must create a token using the /sessions endpoint, and then for all subsequent requests, you must use that token.
For FileMaker server, are they the same principle applied to FileMaker Cloud hosted in AWS?
Yes, it does. So FileMaker Cloud, from the Data API perspective, FileMaker Cloud and FileMaker Server are identical. The API works in exactly the same way. The data usage limits apply in exactly the same way. Question, does this all run over port 443, or do you have to open more ports? It's all done over port 443, so it's all done over the standard HTTPS port. That includes both the access to the data, to uploading images into container, and also to streaming container content back out. All of that's done with HTTPS on port 443. The question was that I mentioned that you can run scripts, and what stops you from changing the data when you run the script? Nothing. So basically, you can, for argument's sake, and in many respects that's what I was doing with my chart, was I was running a script on the server which was modifying, in this case, just a virtual list table, but it was actually modifying data. So yes, you can use scripts to modify data. And one time that can be very useful is if you're wanting to create related data. So for example, if you were creating an invoice and 10 line items, rather than making multiple requests to the line item table, what you might choose to do is to convert all of your line items to a JSON object and pass that in as a script parameter to a create invoice script, which creates the invoice and makes all of the line items and then returns that single invoice record. So yes, that is one of the ways in which FileMaker differs from, the data API differs from many traditional APIs in that you can call scripts. And as you could with the XML interface, you can do pre-request, pre-sort, and standard scripts. And they run at what should be obvious times. So before any find request is made, after the find request, but before any sort, and then after all of the data processing. So you have the option to perform different scripts at each of those points.
For your, if you're trying to execute a script, via the data API, does that account need to have the ability to run scripts? It looked like on there it said scripts all no access or all executable.
Yes, you have to give the account that is trying to run the scripts access, and that can either be because the script is, they have to have script access, and so you do that in your privilege set definition. You basically say allow it to run scripts. There is no value in giving, if that account only has access to the data API, there's no value in giving it the ability to edit scripts because it can't. But yes, you do have to explicitly allow access. Because for some reason, when you base 64 encode a string, you seem to get a value list back, which has the base 64 at the top and an empty carriage return at the bottom. And if you try and send that off, it goes, because it doesn't expect a carriage return. It invalidates the query request. I expect that this is an undocumented and probably undesired outcome of using the base 64 encode function. I don't know why it does it, but it definitely does. There are 3 other data API related sessions: Internet of Things and the FileMaker Data API at 3 o'clock today, FileMaker's Data API for PHP developers at 4:30 today, and FileMaker Data API in Action, which is a sponsor session at 10:30 tomorrow. The first 2 are in this room. The Data API in Action, I'm not sure where the sponsor sessions are, but it's there. There aren't any session updates. All of the materials are already in the community page for this session. Literally everything that I've shown you is there. The source code for the native app, so you could compile that to run in a different environment. The FileMaker databases, and even the dodgy but works usually mobile phone app is there as well. Thank you very much, and please remember to fill out the session evaluations.